Four Crowns. Episode 9. The Waking. Written by Mia. For one white second, I held the whole of it, and I understood why the founders were afraid. I had reached for all four threads at once, not to pour into them the way I'd learned, but to pull, to call the shards home through me, and they came. God, they came so willingly. 300 years of being held apart, and they lunged for each other through my chest like they'd been waiting my whole life for me to stop being careful, and for one impossible heartbeat shadow and flame and tide and iron were not four powers in four men, but one enormous old whole thing remembering its own shape, and the shape was me, and the city below us went silent the way a held breath is silent, and I could have ended the houses right there. I could feel it. One more inch and 300 years of frightened arithmetic simply stopped, and whatever my bloodline had been before the founders broke, it stood up in the world again, in me, in the four men I'd bound. And Cass was dying in the doorway. So I did the thing that was either the bravest or the most cowardly choice in the history of Vaymore, and I still don't know which. I took all that reuniting power, the whole drowned god straining for home, and instead of letting it complete, I bent it. I aimed it. I poured the entire force of four shards trying to become one into a single gold thread going out in a broken doorway, and I healed him. I spent the apocalypse on one disposable man. And then, with the houses 1 inch from ending and the power screaming to finish what it had started, I wrenched it back. I slammed the door I'd opened. I pulled four shards of hair from home and shoved them apart again with nothing but my own will and the flat refusal to decide the fate of a city by accident in a panic. It nearly killed me. I think it should have. But the four of them were there, sable folding shadow around my collapse, rune flooding strength up the tied thread, Bram a wall of iron at my back, and Cass alive, catching me as I came down out of the white. For shards holding their own catalyst together by main force, while she held the end of the world shut with her teeth. The light faded. The houses did not end. And every single soul in Vaymore had just watched a four-colored god flare to life in the source tower and then, deliberately, choose not to be one. Nothing about my life was ever going to be small again. Cass woke a full day later, in the gray hour before dawn, and the first thing he did was laugh, because of course it was. So, he croaked, before his eyes were even properly open, I'm not dead. Either you're very good, or the afterlife has a worse view than advertised. Then he saw my face. I hadn't left the chair beside him in 20 hours, hadn't slept, hadn't let go of his hand. And the joke died, and the real thing came up underneath it, the thing he keeps under all the grinning.
Ava.
What did you do? He'd felt it. They'd all felt it. I was going out. I know what going out feels like. I've watched it happen to people.
There was no coming back from that.
So what did you do? I chose you, I said. You, he stopped. I watched him do the arithmetic his father spent 26 years teaching him, the calculation of his own worth, the one that always came out spare, disposable, the one you spend.
Ava.
The light. The whole city felt the light. That was you reached for the catalyst. You started to bring the shards home. To save me. His voice cracked clean in half. You almost ended the world. For the spare. I almost healed the world, I said, and decided not to, because I wasn't going to make a choice that big in a panic.
But yes.
The part where I reached for everything I am and aimed it at one dying man, because I could not stand to live in a Vaymore without him in it. Yes, Cass. That part was for you.
Specifically you.
Not the bond, not the city, not 3 other men.
You.
The one your father bet his whole cruelty, on being throwaway. I leaned in so he could not look away from it. He built a trap on the idea that nobody would ever spend anything real to keep you. I spend a god. I want you to lie there and understand. With that brilliant head, he convinced you was empty, that you are a man somebody was willing to unmake the world for. Recalculate. And the golden charmer of House Flame, the spare, the unchosen son, put his free hand over his eyes and cried, finally, the way he'd never once let himself, and I climbed onto the narrow bed and held him while he did it, and it was the least funny and most important thing I had ever watched him do. He'd spent 26 years turning every real feeling into a joke before anyone could use it against him, the same way I'd spent mine turning everyone into a shrub before anyone could take it. We were the same animal, Cass and I, raised in different cages to the same trick, make yourself cost nothing so that losing you costs no one. And here we both were at last, finally, expensive. Finally worth the price somebody had refused to stop paying. It is a strange and terrible thing to learn, at the wrong end of a knife, that you are always worth the keeping. When the crying was done, he kissed me, and that was when I learned what the waking had cost. Because it was a good kiss, a real one, Cass finally not performing, his hand coming up into my hair, and the bond going warm and gold and bright between us. And the second it deepened, the second I let myself want him with my whole open chest, the flame thread surged, and behind it all 4 threads lunged, and I felt the shards leap for home again like a door I'd only latched, not locked. I tore my mouth from his, gasping, "Don't wait." The 4-colored light was already gathering at the edges of the room. Bram came through the door at a dead run, feeling it 3 rooms off the way he always did. Sable was a half-second behind him, and I could see in both their faces that they'd felt it too. The lurch, the city tilting toward its own ending because the catalyst had let herself be kissed. I shoved it down, slammed the door again, harder this time, and the light guttered out, and I sat there shaking on the edge of Cass's bed with my own heartbeat trying to end 300 years of history. "That's new," Sable said, very quietly, in the voice he uses when he's most afraid, which is the calmest one. That wasn't there before the flare. "No," I said. It wasn't. I made myself say the whole horror of it out loud because they deserved the truth, and I was done being the only one carrying it. I woke it. Before, the reunion was slow, adrift. The keeper called it, the shards leaning home over years. Now they know the way. I opened the door all the way and slammed it, and the lock is broken. Every time I love one of you too openly, too much, with the whole of me, the bond reaches to finish, and I have to hold the end of the world shut by hand. I laughed, and it came out wrecked. I spent my whole life unable to want anything. I finally learned how, and the price is that wanting you now out loud, all the way, it edges the city toward ending. The one thing I'm not allowed to do is the only thing I want. Rune came then, the last of them, the holder, moving slow because he'd nearly emptied himself drowning the tower and the tide thread was still thin, and he did what he does, which is the thing no one else thinks to do. He didn't strategize it like Sable or rage at it like Bram or joke past it like Cass. He sat down on the floor by the bed, deliberately not touching me, putting careful distance between us, and he said, "Then we learn the depth of it.
Slowly. Together.
The way you read deep water before you swim it. You don't fight the current. You learn where it pulls and you work with it." His quiet eyes found mine. "You're treating this like a curse, Ava. A bomb in your chest." But the keeper said the catalyst was a mercy the founders couldn't believe in. A door at the back of a cage. Maybe the lock breaking isn't the disaster. Maybe it's the cage finally admitting it was always meant to open. He almost smiled. We just have to learn to open it on purpose, when we choose, and not by accident in a kiss. That's all. A control problem. The holder's specialty. And Bram, who had been pacing like a caged thing, stopped and dropped to a crouch in front of me, all that iron-shaped stillness, and put his forehead against my knee the way he does instead of saying the soft thing out loud. "You held it," he said into my knee, fierce and low, 1 inch from the end of everything, hurt, alone in the white, and you held it. You think we're scared of the catalyst. He looked up, and his eyes were wet and blazing. Keystone. We watched you hold the apocalypse shut with your bare hands rather than decide our city's fate without asking it first. There is no version of that thing in your chest that scares me, because I've seen who's holding the door. I'd follow that woman into anything. We all would. We already have. For shards, 1 catalyst. And in that small gray room, for 1 breath, the thing in my chest didn't feel like a bomb. It felt like a family deciding, together, to carry something too big for any one of them, which is, I'm told, the whole definition of the word. But families don't get to decide in private when a whole city watched the god flare. The political truth arrived with the daylight, and it was worse and stranger than the war I'd traded away. Cass's burning page had done its work. The whole of Vaymore now knew that the Lords of Flame and Shadow had forged the assassin that broke the accord, had manufactured the crisis to seize the city for 2 houses out of 4. Both lords were exposed. Both had fled in the chaos of the flare, Flame's lord wounded and gone to ground, Shadow's lady, Sable's mother, vanished into her own district with her credibility in ruins and her hatred intact. The city should have been mine. The houses should have knelt. Instead, Vaymore had seen the 4-colored light, and a city that watches a god almost being born in a tower does not think savior. It thinks what happens the next time she's cornered, or grieving, or in love, and doesn't stop the light. I had answered the Keeper's question with my own body, chosen to heal 1 man and refused, in the same breath, to unmake the city without its consent, and Vaymore had watched me do it and drawn exactly 1 conclusion, that the most dangerous thing in the world was no longer 4 houses fighting over a source. It was 1 frightened woman who could end them all by accident, holding the door shut by hand, and getting tired. And the cruelty of it, the part that kept me awake, was that they were not wrong to be afraid. I had felt the door open in a kiss. I had felt it lean toward home at the mere taste of joy, and now, I was certain it would lean for grief too, and for rage, and for fear, for every large feeling a human being is built to have. They were asking exactly the right question. They were only going to answer it the Founder's way, with a cage and a lock, and 3 more centuries of calling the containment piece. I was the daughter of a line that had been buried alive and called a danger for so long that the city could no longer tell the difference between a bomb and a door. They didn't want to scatter the shards anymore. They didn't want to hold me, or own me, or marry into me. The exposed lords had taught the city the wrong lesson too well, and now Tide and Iron and the leaderless remnants of Flame and Shadow all wanted the same single thing, and they were, for the first time in 300 years, in horrifying agreement about it. The summons came at dusk, sealed with all 4 house marks on 1 page, which had not happened, Rune said softly, since the founding. An emergency convening of the full accord. Every house. Tomorrow, at the High Council, the catalyst to appear and answer. They're not fighting over you anymore, Sable said, reading it twice, his strategist's face going pale in a way I'd never seen.
Ava.
4 house marks on 1 page. They've stopped competing. The thing my mother and Cass's father wanted. All 4 houses acting as one. They've finally got it. Just not the way they planned. He set the page down very carefully, like it might detonate. The city's done deciding who holds the catalyst. It's going to decide whether the catalyst gets to keep existing uncaged at all, or whether 4 houses rebind the right tomorrow, all of them together, and lock the door in your chest shut forever, with you still behind it. "Recontain me," I said. "Make you the keystone they always pretended you were," he said. "A paperweight on a loaded gun. Forever." His eyes met mine, and his guard was all the way down, and what was behind it was terror. And the worst part, the part one can't find a move against. Half of them aren't even wrong to want it. You felt the door open in a kiss, Ava. What's the counter-argument? That you'll never grieve, never panic, never love any of us all the way, for the rest of your life, so the world stays safe. I sat in the high tower with 4 shards of a drowned god strung tight and frightened around me, and a city that had just learned to fear me even more than it wanted me, and a summons in 4 colors of ink ordering me to come and let them decide whether I was allowed to be whole. And I felt the thing in my chest lean, very gently, toward home, the way it would lean now for the rest of my life, every time I felt too much. Including, I realized, fear. The light flickered at the edges of the room. And down all 4 threads, I felt the men I was not allowed to fully love brace, together, around the catalyst they could not afford to let cry, and understood that tomorrow I would have to walk into a room of 4 united houses and convince a terrified city to gamble its whole existence on the self-control of a woman who could no longer even be kissed without the world starting to end. To be continued. That was episode 9 of 4 Crowns. If the 4 of them have you now, the next episode is already waiting. Subscribe so you don't miss it. The complete book is on Amazon, and early episodes plus bonus scenes are on my Patreon. Links are in the description.
I've Mia.
Thank you for listening.